Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Mariam Huss, founder of Axxum Consulting, a professional services firm specializing in human capital, value creation, and talent placement. Mariam brings a global perspective to her work, having lived and worked across multiple markets while leading human capital, change management, and transformation initiatives for more than 2 decades. She has held senior roles at IBM, EY, and KPMG, taught global change management at Northwestern University, and partnered closely with leadership teams navigating complex organizational change. Today, we're going to talk about the human side of value creation in M&A and what determines whether change actually sticks once the deal is done. Mariam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Clint. Thanks you for having me.
Well, I am so excited for this conversation. And as we get started, Mariam, I'd love to hear a bit about your personal career journey. How did your experiences working across different markets shape how you think about organizations, change, and leadership?
Absolutely. So I've worked in different continents, different countries, global projects going from Europe to Africa to North America, including, of course, the US, Canada, and also some projects with Latin America. So and as you can hear, there's a little bit of an accent here. I am actually originally from France. So I can wear different hats, working in different countries, continents, different culture. At the end of the day, there's one thing I'd like to say is that people are people, right? So no matter where you're from, what country, what continent, what company you're working from, it's always about understanding the why. So when a change is happening, people do need to understand why a change is happening, and then you can go from there. So there's a lot of communications, but communications may differ depending on the country, the culture, even within the same company, especially global companies. I like to say that when I'm teaching, doing certification in change management, you may be working for the same company, you may think you have one culture. That's not the case. Even in the US, somebody working in California versus Texas, you may see things differently.
Yeah, that is so true. I frequently have to remind leaders that when we do cultural due diligence, that early on, we're getting the perspective of the people at the very top of the company. And if we think the CFO has the same perspective as a machinist working in one of the factories, then we're kidding ourselves.
Absolutely.
So you've done a lot of complex cross-border deals. So you've talked about leaders underestimating the need to understand why. Where are some other places that you see leaders underestimate the people side of M&A?
So what I typically tell when I'm coaching, leaders is assume nothing, trust no one. This is one of my favorite mantra because as you just mentioned, you may be communicating something. People have their own biases. And so they may perceive what you're saying very differently. We have our own life, our day to day job. So the way you communicate may be taken differently depending on who you're talking to. So that's the number one thing I tell leaders is yes, you do need to communicate, but also you need to listen. And so sometimes it's easier to have external consultant like mine, like me, or somebody on my team to go and talk to people because they may not be more inclined to tell you exactly how they feel because it's how I feel. How is my job being impacted? And so at the end of the day, there's a lot of communication, talking, but also listening. And it's easier said than done.
Yeah, absolutely. I have found that there have been times when it's really helpful to bring in a neutral third party just because
Right,
that trust can be, well, can be broken so quickly. And I think that there's often this unintended dynamic that some leaders have where they come in a little more arrogant than I think they feel, and so
right.
it can be really hard to engage with that when you're worried that person sees you as somehow beneath them. And I know most leaders, that's not their intention, but sometimes that's how that gets broadcast.
Thank you for mentioning trust because that's another thing. Building trust takes time. So if it's a
Mm,
new leader working for a new team with a new team, that will take time. It's like culture change, that takes time. But everything wants, especially in the M&A world, things have to go fast. Unfortunately, that's what I caution leaders is that building trust and then culture change takes time. So you have to give yourself some grace as a leader because, again, it takes time.
yeah, it's a really great point. So I know you've got some great stories, Miriam. I would love to hear one of the stories about a deal that you've worked on where it was about how the people experience change that either made the deal or broke the deal.
So, example that I can give you is when it's again all about going back to communications. So when it's not clear in people's mind, yep, a deal just happened, but what does it really mean for me? The what's in it
Mm,
for me? That's number one, and it's really hard to sell that. So for those who stay, for instance, after a deal, and you know your colleague were let go, and you are gaining more work, there's a lot again of talking points that we're always coaching our leaders is that have some empathy. That's number one, because again, we're all human. Change is hard. People, and that's another thing I like to say, everybody likes change, but nobody wants to change, right? So, and we're laughing, but that's true. People
it
like
is.
change, but when it's at me, even me with over 20 years of experience, I like change. It's nice and shiny, but when it's me that has to make the shift and
Right.
change of behaviors, and I don't know how things will be in the future state. It's hard. That's just human nature. So the caution that I give leaders is just expect some sort of resistance. That's going to happen. It's just a matter of how you're going to plan for it. Just expect it and plan for it. So that's number one. I want to go back to the trust again. So
Yeah.
trust building is very important because once you lose trust, it's really hard to get back to it, to have people coming back and, gaining that trust back. Because when employees trust their leaders, it's much easier, trust me, to take them along the way,
Right.
right? And going back to the lack of clarity and expectations on roles and responsibilities, that's something that we usually are really good at helping, leaders, supervisors, and managers. So it's very clear in people's mind in the future state, in 6 months, in a month, in 2 weeks, what are you expected? What are the expectations essentially? And that needs to be tied as well from a performance management perspective. Sometimes also bonuses or salary increase. It doesn't matter. You just need to work with HR and the leaders to make sure that it's very clear. And then there's all the work around communications and training. And you would think those are things that are just common sense. But when you're into the details, the nitty gritty of the work, it tends to be put aside. So yes, we need to go back into operations, right? Where is the ROI? We're looking at the finances, but again, from an M&A perspective, people is anything related to people is to me that's my experience unfortunately is kind of set aside. So
Right.
let's get back to, the basics, because again, if you don't have the people to do the work, then nothing's going to work at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think you hit on a couple of things that I think are really useful. I know a lot of times when we talk about change management in M&A, and I listen to business leaders, Miriam, that talk about this, and what I see is that they think their communications plan is the same as change management. And
Right,
what I love about what you just shared is you talked
right,
about the importance of listening, because
right,
if it's really just a broadcast plan, that's different than true
right,
communication.
right,
And then the real value of training, of incentives, of
right.
some of these other pieces that you mentioned to really help drive the change. Do you have an example where you might have worked with a client, or in a past life where you were able to bring all those factors together to make a change after an M&A deal?
Yes. So for me, from experience, what worked really well, and I have an example of a past clients I did a couple years ago when there's few things. Number one, you start at the top with leadership alignment.
Okay.
When it's clear at the leadership level, even if you may have sometimes just a sponsor, when at the executive leadership level, everybody's aligned, we know where we're marching to, what are our goals, what we're really trying to achieve, and everybody's aligned and behind the change, right? That's number one, because otherwise it's going to trickle down and that's not going to work, or it's going to be really hard to implement the change. Number two, you do need to look at capacity, bandwidth of people that will be working on whatever change initiative you're working on, having the right people with the right skill set who will be able to implement that change. Another thing that I've seen that works really well is the concept of a change agent network. Sometimes you'll hear change champion network or influencer network is when you do have a representation of roles, or it could be locations if it's something that where a change that it will be impacted different locations. And in my case, because we're talking about global, right? Different countries, even better, you do need representation. So an example that I like to give is I've done a project years ago where they were trying to implement a new tool after a merger. So two companies, multiple legacy systems, multiple legacy, processes, and the goal of the project was to standardize everything. So one tool, one process, of course, few tweaks here and there depending on the locations, but overall everything had to be standardized. Now, remember when I joined the project, they did have somebody working on change management, but they wanted to have a go live that was in China, literally around the New Year of
Oh,
China, which is different from here. Nobody thought about asking. It was just done here, right in the US. And so nobody thought about asking, hey, can we actually have that date for this country? It just didn't work. So we had to pause, go back, all because of what? Because we didn't have a representation locally. And nowadays, of course, with we know all those national holidays, but sometimes you do have specific from, I don't know, specific holidays that you may not know. It's not in the calendar. So to mitigate those type of risks, you do want to have representation. So again, from different countries, if you're working on a global, change, or even from a role perspective. So you have a better understanding even for communications, for instance, people can tell you, well, the way we receive communication in this facility, in this, manufacturing site is this way or that way. So it's not just trying to put one fit for all. So that's and then the last one is how fast the communication can go, because that's another story I can share where you want one single source of truth to communicate all that big information, but there's a process behind, right? When you have multiple layers to review a com that needs to go out from the CFO or CEO or CRO, it doesn't matter. So you want to make sure that you are planning ahead of time. And just to go back to what you were saying earlier, a lot of organizations think that communications is change management, but that's not the case. I mean, you just heard what I said. There's multiple layers. It's not just comms.
yeah. That's fantastic points. I want to go back for a moment to what you said about change capacity. So much good stuff in there, but
Yeah.
change capacity has been on my mind a lot and a lot of people right now because we've got all this AI driven change going on, which
Mm,
you put that with an M&A change and geopolitical change. We're just
mm,
living in an area, a point in time where change is all around us. And instead of having one or two things changing, it is just all over the place. In fact, HBR from the end of 2025, one of their cover stories was, can we keep up with the pace of change? And so I would love to hear your thoughts on,
right.
as a change manager, I would
Right.
love to hear your thoughts on how you can tell that an organization is ready for the change, or maybe it's time to pause and slow down so that the change gets done well. How do you navigate that?
How do we do this? Is I personally use a tool from ProSci
Okay.
that is basically assessing the change readiness and the risk, right, for an organization to implement a change. So there's a
Okay.
tool, there's multiple tools out there. I use one from ProSci, which is again a global organization that does certification in change management. Very well done to basically assess the readiness for that change saturation or change fatigue. I do get this question quite often from my clients. There's so many things happening at the same time. So the best answer that I go back to my clients, I said, this is basically on you and on the leadership team. You need to decide what you want to prioritize for your company. And it's easier when you have a program management office who's overseeing all the
Mhm.
different initiatives in an organization. For mid-size or smaller organizations, sometimes you just don't have a program management office. So that goes back to the leadership team. They should know what they want to prioritize. So it's not even on us, the change practitioners, even the project managers, technically, but it's really back to the leadership team. What do you want to prioritize for your company for the next quarter, to the next 6 months, for the next 1 or 2 years? I'm going to be honest with you. I stopped saying, what's your 5 year plan? Things are changing so
Right.
fast. I don't even talk about a 5 year plan. It's usually 2 to 3 max. Again, between AI and everything else you talked about, geopolitical, everything is changing so fast that let's talk about the next couple years and then we can go from there.
Right. Right. I have noticed I've worked across a number of companies, and I've noticed that the company's pace of change often has to do with how they make money. And this is just something I've noticed. When I work
Mm,
in aerospace, the
mhm.
the product development cycle can be a decade. So change happened a
Right,
little more slowly
right.
versus working in retail where you
Mhm.
sell seasonal merchandise every
True.
few months, and those organizations are in almost constant upheaval. And so it seems to me that depending on the company, their
Mhm.
ability to do change quickly or slowly
That's true.
is going to be
That's true.
different as well. So let's talk a little bit about corporate change planning for a moment. So I know that a lot of people see a gap in how change is seen by the leadership team. They're usually aware of the deal
Mhm.
long before the employees are, and the employees experience it a little bit differently. How do you
Mhm.
help leaders to navigate those differences between what they're experiencing at the top and what the employees who are, learning out about a deal much later, how they experience it?
Very good question. And I hear quite often at the employee level, oh, this is corporate, this is HQ. Like we're not doing this, we're not working the same way. Or
Yeah.
again, it's them telling us what to do. We don't have a say. So my recommendation again is to listen and
Okay.
to give some room for people to voice their concerns. That's number one priority that I typically give leaders. So going back to empathy, it's one thing you do have to make a decision though, right? And so going back to explaining the why, explain why we're doing this. So people, because that's the number one barrier for change adoption or engagement for employees. People first need to understand why something is implemented or changing, right? Once that's done, give them some space so they can voice, their concerns, ask questions, leave some room, and it's okay. I know some leaders they want to have an answer for everything, but it's okay if you don't know the answer. Just say it. The worst thing that could happen is either lying, of course, or silent, not saying anything at all. It's better to say, you know what, I don't have the answer yet.
Mhm.
I should know by XYZ or by that time, that month, that week, and I'll get back to you. But you do need to get back to people because that's
Yeah.
another thing that I've noticed. We don't know yet, we'll get back to you, and then cricket. That's not good either because then people will make their own assumption. And that's where bleep will hit the fan. So make sure that you communicate clearly, be transparent, have some empathy. Make sure that yes, we do have to make decision at the HQ or corporate level, but again, give some room for people to even have a say. And then if you can incorporate some of those, some of the feedback, then of course if they can, you can do it as the leadership team. The other thing that I typically tell the leaders is you can have a plan, but it has to be a living plan. So things will change. It's not a uh, if, it's a when, right? So just have some expectation that you may think that okay, this we're implementing this tool or this new process, or we're trying to change the culture because we're merging two companies and we want this to be done by XYZ time. No, you're going to have some back and forth. It's just reality. And then I would just want to go back around expectations of roles and responsibilities. And to me, because you have the leadership team at the top, you have the employees, but to me, the critical role are it's the managers.
Yeah.
So those people, to me, if you don't have them in your pocket, it's going to be really, really hard to implement a change. They're close to the change. Employees will go to their manager, supervisor, if they have any questions related to the change. Leadership team will rely on the manager to cascade information, right? So if they're not on board, it's going to be really hard to implement a change. That's for sure. And then going back to the feedback and empathy. So those are really best practices that I basically coach leaders that I'm working with to implement. And it's a better than the road is it's a little better and more smooth rather than just trying to implement some and being I say where it's not a dictatorship when you're trying to implement a change because
Right.
it's just not gonna work. It may work on the short term, but in the long run, people will revert in their old ways of working, which is the worst as a change practitioner. So it's one thing to implement, but you want also that the change to stick and sustain. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time and money.
Yeah. Well, and then people walk out the door if it's too much or if
That's
they
another
don't
risk.
understand why they're doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You brought up something that I don't know that we talk about nearly enough in M&A. I'm thinking back about the conversations I've had over the last decade plus, and I think I can count on one hand the number of times I've had discussions about the leadership team's ability to change on their own. So you mentioned it's not a
Yes.
dictatorship. It really
Right.
does need to be a partnership with the workforce. So do you have any tips for leaders that might find themselves wanting to be, let's use the term stronger leaders, because I don't know that many of us would identify as, want to identify as dictators, but, leaders that are having a hard time changing their plans because their teams just aren't ready for the change.
Really, it's again back to communications and empathy.
Yeah.
You need to meet where your team is, unfortunately. And I've seen that as well. Sometimes, as a leader, you may inherit a team that you didn't build,
Mhm.
or they may not be there from a skill set perspective. And you may be thinking having some targets. That's just not going to happen. right? So if you have the budget to hire new team members or consultant to support you to get to where you want to go, great. Otherwise, you may have to work with what you have. And so it's just a matter of and closing the gap, essentially. So try to understand where your team is, where you want to go, and then you close the gap by training, coaching your own team, and you can go from there. But unfortunately, sometimes it's not even the leader's fault. It's just you're inheriting a team that is just not there. So again, it will take time. So have some grace, some realistic as well goals for yourself, rather than trying to get to somewhere and that's not going to happen because you don't have the right team in place. Or you may be bold and scratch and try to rebuild the team, right? That's another thing you could do. But again, sometimes you may not have a choice to work with what you have.
Yeah, and a lot of times in the M&A context where I've seen leaders that have I've worked with a leader who was like, "Well, we'll just fire everybody and start from scratch." And I'm like, "Well, then why did you just spend millions of dollars
Right.
buying this team? That just doesn't seem to be,
Right.
a good idea." That was said in frustration, to be fair. I don't think it's
Yeah.
where that person's heart really was, but it was in a moment of "Come on," uh, So, one of the other things, Mariam, that you had talked about was leadership alignment. And I'd be really
Right.
curious if you have any stories or examples about what happens when you align leadership teams, ways that you've aligned leadership teams. I'd love to hear more about that. And if you've got an example, that'd be fantastic.
Yes, story time, story time. In the manufacturing industry, a new CEO came in and had way too many people reporting to him. I think at the time it was like 16 people.
Oh,
So
wow.
what can you get done on an ELT? It was for sure more than 13 people. So first and foremost, as for that example specifically, we revamped and reorganized the leadership team, the ELT. We went from, I think it was maybe 15 people down to seven. I think it was
Okay.
half gone. So we're able to realign, setting clear expectations, roles and responsibilities, KPIs, making sure that everybody was aligned. How do we work better together? Because that project was also a lot of org design, so reshaping, the different departments and functions. Really, really great project, but that's how we started at the top. It has to start at the top, so the leader has to be very clear on what they're trying to accomplish, what team they want to have in place, and off we go. But you have to have the right team in place, which is what we did first. And then we went down through every single functions and department to do the exact same thing. So n minus one, minus two, minus three, all the way down, and looking at again roles and responsibilities, having clear again KPIs, because again, it wasn't even clear in people's mind. And then lots of communications to re-explain the RACI model, right? Who's responsible for what, accountable, consulted, and informed. So then going to, after the communications, also training people on their new roles and responsibilities, but also explaining how we will work because it was a very heavy um, basically, they were heavily working into silos, which we see quite often. And then they were shifting into a matrix environment, which has pros and cons, to be honest with you, especially for the reporting relationship. So it was a lot of change management, which includes communications, training, and also engagement from employees. And
Yeah.
then you can gain really good alignment across the board from the top all the way down throughout the organization.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Miriam, as we wrap up our time together, I know that a lot of the folks who are listening are executives and HR leaders who are preparing for a transaction. So, what are two or three questions that they should be asking themselves about talent and culture as they get ready to close their deals?
Do I have the right team in place? Even myself, if I would do a self assessment, where are my blind spots, right? What am I missing? Because I need to have on my team things that I cannot do or I have some blind spot on. So making sure that you have the right team in place. Typically, my recommendation is to do an assessment, right, for the whole team. And then you may have to make some tough decision to replace or to train and coach some of your team members if they have the right attitude. Because to me, at the end of the day, if you do have the right attitude and you're willing to work and learn, that's one thing. But if you're arrogant and, it's just as I say, this is where I'm good at, and I'm not willing to learn, to me, that's not the right skill that I want to have on my team. And that's not what I recommend. So making sure that you understand the strengths and weaknesses of your team, and then you can go from there to make sure that you have the right team in place to get to the finish line.
Yeah, that's a really important one. And I think you're right. I think that's one that's not done often enough.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Mariam, for listeners who want to continue the conversation or learn more about your work, what's the best way for them to find you or get in touch?
Great question. Easy. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in the search button Mariam Huss, and you'll be able to find me. Also, follow our LinkedIn page on Axxum Consulting, AXXUM Consulting. People can follow us as well. This is our business LinkedIn page, or they can simply go to our website, axxumconsulting.com.
Perfect. And we'll put all of those links in the show notes for people who want to follow
Great.
along. Yeah. Well,
Great.
Mariam,
Thank
it
you.
has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Clint.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.